Falcha, welcome back to part 7, and now we're on Don McLean, American Pie. He implied in his song American Pie that the whole Altamont thing was a ritual murder with Jagger on stage in the role of Satan. There was a lot of acid at Altamont thanks to Augustus. And he supplied acid for the Monterey Pops, the Human Be-In in 1967, and Altamont. Vito Polakis also danced on a side platform at Altamont. Gram and the Stones fled. They were taken off in helicopter. Gram's sister got pregnant, and his stepfather had her institutionalized. She begged Gram for help, and he ignored her. He married Gretchen, the 16-year-old, at his father's house in New Orleans. And then he made an album with Emmylou Harris. He and Gretchen moved back to Laurel Canyon, and there were a series of tragedies starting in July of 1973. Brandon DeWilde, who was the child star, was killed in a car wreck. Clarence White, one of the musicians, was hit by a car and killed. A house in Laurel Canyon burned down, and the people inside of it were hospitalized with smoke inhalation, and people inside of it being Stephen Stills, I think, and his wife Gretchen, and they moved into Gretchen's father's estate. And then, no, not Stephen Stills, Gram Parsons. Sorry, I'm getting them all confused. Mostly because I don't really know them very well. But Gram Parsons is the one who married Gretchen. He's the one whose stepfather took them in after the house burned down. In September of 73, he died in Joshua Tree. It was called an OD, but it was never investigated. There was no toxicology. He was never autopsied, nothing like that. And he was in Joshua Tree looking for UFOs. No one really knows what killed him. There are a lot of actually conflicting stories. There's the prevailing story, the official story, but there's a lot of other stories. His friends got the body at LAX, took it back to Joshua Tree, and burned it ritually. They were each charged $300 by the cops, and they had to pay for the coffin. His sister and his niece died in a tragic boating accident in 1990. His sister was only 40 and her daughter was 16. Chapter 17, The Lost Expedition of Gene Clark. So, Harold Eugene Clark was born in November of 44 in Tipton, Missouri. His dad was with Patton in Germany. They had 10 children. They lived in a spooky, remote house at the end of a dirt road in the woods, and his friends all considered the whole situation extremely strange. He threw knives at boxes. His family threw knives at boxes for entertainment. Gene had a lifelong obsession with knives and guns. In 2005, this is just a little rundown of what happened to some of his siblings. One was a paranoid schizophrenic. Another was clinically depressed. A third was homeless and untreated mental illness. The fourth was on psychiatric medication. The fifth was diagnosed bipolar, and the sixth had severe mental delays. The father was a raging alcoholic with severe mood swings, and Clark began at strict Catholic schools where the nuns were extremely abusive. There were quotations from people who went to school with him. His high school friends that he hung out with are all in prison. He was offered a spot on the New Christy Minstrels. He partied with Johnson's daughter after the show, President Johnson's daughter, after the show when they performed at the White House. He heard his first Beatle album, dumped the New Christy Minstrels, and took his interest in the Beatles to LA. He hung out at the Troubadour. He met Mcgowan and then Crosby. And Jim Dixon formed the Byrds. And he wanted to copy the Beatles, but Crosby couldn't sing, so they couldn't copy the Beatles. They were renamed from the Beefeaters to the Byrds, and they signed with Atlantic. Clark was drafted, and he got a deferment for a football injury. He was a prolific songwriter, but Crosby was really jealous and would not record his music. Because money is in music royalties, he sold his songs to other bands and got wealthy while the Byrds were struggling. They were jealous, and he had to give them song credits on a lot of the songs of his that did go onto the albums. If they would let him play his songs on the albums, if he would say they wrote them. He hooked up with Vito and the Freaks, and nobody was listening to the band, and they actually didn't do as well in England because people couldn't watch the Freaks. They had to listen to the band. And he quit in March of 66 and was unsuccessful with his own attempt at a band. And like everybody else, he had an affair with Michelle Phillips, and he filled in with the Byrds when Crosby took off. He married a woman named Carly, who was an avid occultist, and this is around 1971. Let's see here, page 195. Circa 71, Clark was approached by his friend and fellow Canyonite Dennis Hopper to compose songs for the soundtrack on Hopper's American Dreamer. Around that same time, according to Ellerson, Gene's running buddies included David Carradine and John Barrymore. That was to say, at the least, a rather curious group of friends. According to authors such as Craig Heimbichner, Martin Starr, John Carter, Dennis Hopper and John Carradine, David Carradine's father, were both members of the infamous Agape Lodge of the OTO, alongside doomed rocket scientist Jack Parsons, actor Dean Stockwell, and doppelgangers L. Ron Hubbard and Robert Heinlein. According to another book, John Carradine and John Barrymore were also members of the so-called Bundy Drive Boys, a group that engaged in such practices as incest, rape, and cannibalism. And according to Ed Sanders, among the upscale homes visited by a process work group was the John Barrymore Mansion located on Summit Ridge Drive in Laurel Canyon. So these people have too much time and money on their hands, apparently, because they're all into so many bizarre things. Later, he split with his wife, moved to Laurel Canyon, and he got involved with the doctor's daughter who sold coke and heroin. He was good friends with, I need a better light here. Let's see if I can do this. Good friends with Kurt Russell. Remember Kurt Russell, The Travels of Jamie McPheeters? I was in love with him when I was, 9. By the way, that's a great book, The Travels of Jamie McPheeters. It's a great children's book. It's a challenging children's book, but it's a marvelous story. And it was where the Osmonds broke into Hollywood. They were a group of siblings who sang every episode. They sang around the campfire, and they were all named after books of the Bible in the show. So he was good friends with Kurt Russell, and in May of 1991, he dropped dead after a night of drugs and alcohol, and apparently there were numerous people who showed up for a very panicked cleanup. There was a big scene at the memorial. This is gross. A scene at the memorial. David Carradine pulled him up out of the coffin and screamed at him, made accusations, sexual accusations against him. They say probably he had a serious dissociative disorder his whole life. Chapter 18, The Wolf King of Los Angeles, Papa John Phillips. He was born John Edmund Andrew Phillips, August 30th, 1935, to Edna and Claude, who was a Marine Corps officer and an engineer. Edna was a psychic and faith healer. Her 11 siblings were gunfighters and bandits. At a year old, she was kidnapped by gypsies, and her father found her in Mexico a year later. Bizarre. And she met Claude at the age of 15. So they got married. Claude won a bar in a poker game. Their first child was Rosie. Edna was 18. This was in 1922. And she eventually became a career Pentagon employee. Late in the 1920s, Claude sent was sent to Haiti, and then to Quantico, and then to Nicaragua, and then to Alexandria, Virginia. And John went to strict Catholic military schools. He was an altar boy, but he had a dark side. He got in trouble for vandalism, breaking and entering, fighting. His mother, Edna, cruised for men and had boyfriends. She had one boyfriend, particularly U.S. Army Colonel G. Lacey. He went to Annapolis, John did, and then dropped out. He worked on a fishing boat with one retired Navy officer and 4 retired Army generals and him on a fishing boat. He married Susie Adams, the descendant of John Adams, and she was a practitioner of voodoo. I mean, this just gets crazier. Phillips was traveling in Havana and somehow or other involved in Cuban politics during the revolution, happened to be traveling down there when it happened and got scooped off the street for a live TV show. Appeared on a live TV show. He went to LA and performed at amateur nights at Pandora's Box. He met Holly Michelle Gilliam, who was born November of 44 in Long Beach. Her dad was a merchant marine and her mother was a preacher's kid, and she died when Michelle was 5. Her dad took the children to Mexico so that he could go to college on a GI Bill. When he came back, he became an LA probation officer. His job often required him to go out of town because probation officers leave town. In 1958, Michelle found a mother figure, a mentor, in a woman named Tamar Hodel, who was only 23, not a whole lot much older than her. Her dad was George Hodel, and there was an article about him in Vanity Fair in December of 2007. And if you think that this book could not possibly get any weirder, wait till you hear this. So, her father, George Hodel, was considered the most pathologically decadent man in Los Angeles and the city's venereal disease czar and a fixture in its A-list demimonde. It also noted was that George Hodel shared with Man Ray, the photographer, a love for the work of the Marquis de Sade and the belief that the pursuit of personal liberty was worth everything. Or, in other words, Hodel embraced the all-purpose Luciferian creed, do what thou wilt. According to the same article, Tamar and her siblings had grown up in her father's Hollywood house, which resembled a Mayan temple. I've seen it, and it was bizarre. Was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son and was the site of wild parties in which Hodel was sometimes joined by director John Huston and photographer Man Ray. The luxurious home reported features, among other amenities, a subterranean walk-in vault, which was always a nice thing to have around. Within the walls of that singularly odd Hollywood Hills home, which lies about 3 miles due east of the mouth of Laurel Canyon, Tamar has talked of how she often uncomfortably posed nude for dirty old Man Ray and had once wriggled free from a predatory John Huston. Her father, not so shockingly, had committed incest with her when she was 11. There's a reason why we're reading about this. She got pregnant at 14 by her father. He wanted her to have the baby. She thought that was not such a great idea. And her friends helped her to get an abortion. Her father pistol whipped her stepmother, who was, by the way, John Huston's ex-wife, for helping her to get the abortion. And the ex-wife of John Huston, who was pistol whipped by Hodel, helped Tamar to go into hiding. In 1949, there was an incest trial. This is not just empty accusations. This really happened. The sensational 1949 incest trial featured a witness who took the stand to describe being hypnotized at a Hodel party. Allegations that the rich and powerful were dabbling in incest, hypnotism, pedophilic orgies, and Luciferian philosophies most surely have been shocking to Angelenos in the 40s, as they would still be to most Americans today. Perhaps that's why the jury chose not to believe Tamar and instead acquitted Dr. Hodel. Of course, it should probably be factored in that Tamar was roundly vilified by both the Jerry Geisler-led defense team, and the local press. Let's see. Tamar, who had been described by Michelle as the epitome of glamour, quickly took the youngster under her wing, buying her clothes, enrolling her in modeling school, teaching her to drive, and providing her with a fake ID and a steady stream of prescription drugs, obtained, one would presume, from her father. According to Michelle, Tamar put on perfect airs around my dad, and when it became necessary, she would sleep with him. That perhaps explains why, in early '61, Gil did not have a problem with allowing his underage daughter to move to San Francisco with her surrogate mom. Soon enough, Tamar found herself in a relationship with journeyman Scott McKenzie, and bandmate John Phillips began coming by Tamar and Michelle's room on a nightly basis. It wasn't long before Michelle, still just 16, was romantically involved with 25-year-old Phillips, despite the fact that John was still married to and living with Susie Adams, with whom he by then had 2 children. Laura Mackenzie Phillips, having been born in '59 in Alexandria, Virginia. Father Gil, who had recently taken a 16-year-old bride of his own, still wasn't concerned, and it's probably safe to assume that Philip's father, who had pursued his bride when she was just 15, would not have been too concerned either. Pretty grim. Pretty grim story here. Sorry, I'm trying to get this light so that it's not bizarre, but it is bizarre. Sorry about that. So, Hodel, Dr. George Hodel. This book doesn't go into great detail about this particular fact. He was the abortionist of the stars. He was the one who kept all the medical secrets of the infidelities and misbehavior of people in Hollywood. He knew everyone who had sexually transmitted diseases, everybody who had an abortion, everybody who was fooling around with everybody else, and he was a sick cookie. He was still the prime suspect in the Black Dahlia murder. Her body was posed like Man Ray's photo, the Minotaur. John Phillips was in Jacksonville, Florida, beside 2 air naval stations for a rest during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But 2 months later, he married Michelle. With Denny Doherty, he formed a trio and then went to the Caribbean for 2 weeks of acid, during which Cass Elliot showed up. Cass, Ellen Naomi Cohen, was born in Baltimore, grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, went to George Washington High School with John Phillips. They formed the Mamas and the Papas and wrote their first album in the Caribbean, and it's pretty much widely believed it was the best songs that they ever did do. There are a number of stories of how these songs were written. John and Michelle say they were written in New York. Then they sometimes say they were written driving to Los Angeles. And then they say they were written in a different year, in 1963. Then they say they were written for McGuire. And then they say they were written in the Caribbean. Probably likely they don't know. I think he was implying there that they didn't write them at all, that they were handed to them as a product of the military-industrial complex. This is too much. They returned to LA, and in 1 month they had producer, manager, record deal, and a house in Laurel Canyon. They soon bought Jeanette MacDonald's mansion in Bel Air, 5 acres, 5 Rolls Royces, and a 24-hour party. They were only together from 65 to 68, the Mamas and the Papas. They had a reunion in '71 for contractual purposes. They made 5 albums, they had 11 top 40 singles, and they sold 100 million albums. Their number 1 first album went to number 1. Their second album, Michelle got kicked off for having an affair with Denny. Their third album was a bit of a flop. They did close the Monterey Pops live concert in 1967 and were really bad. 2 months later, they did their last TV performance on the Ed Sullivan Show. Then they went to Europe and broke up. John and Michelle were friends with, hang on, In addition to all the singers and musicians living in Laurel Canyon, this power couple's circle of friends included Warren Beatty, Peter and Jane Fonda, Jack Nicholson, Terry Melcher and his girlfriend Candice Bergen, Marlon Brando, Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, soon-to-be-dead gossip columnist Steve Brandt, Larry Hagman, presidential brother-in-law Peter Lawford, fresh from his alleged involvement in covering up the murder of Marilyn Monroe, Dennis Hopper, Ryan O'Neal, Mia Farrow, Peter Sellers, and Zsa Zsa Gabor, and a short, scraggly singer-songwriter by the name of Charles Manson. There were, to be sure, numerous ties between the Mamas and the Papas and Charles Manson, and between the Mamas and the Papas and the Cielo Drive victims. John Phillips, for example, had invested $10,000 in Jay Sebring's business venture, Sebring International, which was rumored to have been a front for various illegal activities, including drug trafficking. Michelle Phillips had a brief affair with Roman Polanski in London while Polanski was married to the soon-to-be-murdered Sharon Tate. During that same sojourn to London, Tate was reportedly initiated into the practice of witchcraft. Mama Cass, as previously noted, lived just across the road from the house at 2774 Woodstock Road, occupied by Folger and Frykowski. Both homes were frequently visited by known drug dealers. Regulars at Cass's home included Pick Dawson, also a regular at the Frykowski and Folger home, and at the Tate and Polanski home, the son of a U.S. State Department official who, according to John Phillips, was suspected by authorities of using diplomatic pouches to move drugs between countries. And Billy Doyle, a local dealer who Dennis Hopper claimed was filmed while being flogged at the Tate Polanski house just 3 days before the murders. Another regular was Bill Mentzer, later convicted of the murder of Cotton Club producer Roy Radin. The LAPD once described Mentzer as a member of some kind of hit squad. What a mess. John Phillips made his third marriage. The Process Church tried to recruit Abigail Folger, Mama Cass, John Phillips, and Melcher. So close were the ties between the Mamas and the Papas and the Manson clan that both John Phillips and Mama Cass were slated to appear as witnesses for the defense at the family's trial, though neither was ever called. For a band that sang about being safe and warm if I was in L.A., the members of the Mamas and the Papas kept some pretty dangerous company in the City of Angels. So John Phillips was on his third marriage. Crowley follower Genevieve Waite, and guests at the wedding, Jerry Brown and Mike Curb, the governor and lieutenant governor candidates. His daughter, Bijou, that he had with Genevieve, was taken away by the foster care system in New York because they were so drugged out they couldn't take care of her. They moved to a Laurel Canyon home built by William Randolph Hearst. Cass went to London and in July of 74 died in Harry Nilsson's flat. She'd done a lot of TV after the band and was married twice. In 63 to singer Jim Hendrix, not Jimi Hendrix with an X, but Jim Hendrix, to avoid the draft. She married him to help him out. And they did have a daughter, April 26, 67. In 71, she married Baron Donald von Wiedemann, a wealthy Bavarian heir, and that only lasted a couple of months. Denny Doherty hosted a popular variety show in Canada, and he died in 2007 of kidney failure. Michelle went into acting, Knots Landing, Hotel, Beverly Hills 90210. She had numerous flings and marriages. John, in 75, did the soundtrack for The Man Who Fell to Earth. Did anybody else see that movie? I saw that movie, and it was just painful. And a Warhol flop called The Man in the Moon. It was a musical. He lived in Laurel Canyon next to Chuck the Wizard, who was an occultist. Chuck the Wizard. In 1981, he bought a pharmacy, so he'd have unlimited access. And he was laid with serious charges, and he served 3.5 weeks. He tried various iterations of the Mamas and the Papas with new band members and had no luck. In 1992, he had a liver transplant, and months later, photos were taken of him drinking in a bar. He died of heart failure in 2001. He had daughters, Mackenzie, who was in American Graffiti. He signed legal guardianship of her to the producer of the movie, Gary Kurtz. She got a role in One Day at a Time, and in the third season was arrested for public drunkenness and cocaine, and also used them on the set. She was fined in 1980. She had 2 near-fatal ODs, but she was invited back in 81, but collapsed and fired in 82. In 1992, she went through 9 months of rehab and then remained low profile for many years. But in August of 2008, she was arrested at LAX with heroin and coke, and in Halloween in 2008, she pled guilty and was allowed to go into rehab. 1 year later, she wrote a tell-all book called High on Arrival. She was injected with coke at the age of 11. She was raped by her father the night before she was first married. She had an incestuous affair that lasted 10 years with her father and got pregnant, did not know who the father was. In 2010, her sister China went into rehab. In 1990, she formed a band with Carney and Wendy Wilson called Wilson Phillips, daughters of Brian Wilson. In 1995, she married William Baldwin, Alec Baldwin's brother, and became a fervent born-againer. She was baptized by Stephen Baldwin, her brother-in-law, in a bathtub. Bijou Lily Phillips was born April 1st, 1980. She was a crack baby. She went into foster care, but was reunited, unfortunately, with her father in the 3rd grade. That probably didn't do her any favors. She became a wild child in New York. And as a 14-year-old, she was a model for Calvin Klein jeans, pictures that were considered kiddie porn, and said that this creepy guy, Ron Jeremy, was the technical advisor. His mother was OSS, the precursor to the CIA. His uncle worked with Bugsy Siegel, and he went to high school with George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA. She alluded, Bijou did, to incest and won't talk about it, but says she writes about it and does music about it and says, stop asking me, it's blatantly obvious. In 1999, she made her film debut, and she is a Scientologist. Chapter 19, Hungry Freaks, Daddy Frank Zappa. Oh, God. Okay. The fact that Frank Zappa was one of the most prominent rock star residents of Laurel Canyon did not change the fact that he viewed the Flower Power Underground with amused contempt, written by Barney Hoskins, the author of Hotel California. Frank openly made fun of the very counterculture he was helping to sustain. This is Grace Slick, vocalist for the Jefferson Airplane. Zappa was born on December 21st, 1940 in Baltimore. His father was from Sicily. In 1908, he came to the United States and did high school. His father did high school and university in North Carolina and went into military intelligence. Frank Zappa went to school at the Edgewood School and the Edgewood Arsenal Complex, where they did U.S. chemical warfare research and human mind control experiments. His dad taught at Monterey Naval Postgraduate School, and I know from relatives that were involved that that is one weird place. He went to San Diego to work on the Atlas Missile Project, the first ICBMs with chemical warheads. He went to Edwards Air Force Base, and from there, the Byrds, Clarence White, Dewey Brunel, and Don Vlight, who is Captain Beefheart, met them all. At 15, his mom gave him a gift of a conversation with Edgard Varese, a famous composer. And in 1958, how she did that, nobody knows, but she arranged it. In 1958, he was allowed to graduate Antelope Valley High short of credits. They just wanted to get rid of him. Went to Pomona College at 18 and married Kay Sherman at the age of 20 in 1960, and that marriage lasted 4 years. He worked in underground occult films, The World's Greatest Sinner. He did music with Terry Kirkman of the Association. He was taught by a marine electrical expert how to do a recording studio. In March of 63, he was on the Steve Allen Show where he played a bicycle. On March of 65, he was charged with conspiracy to commit pornography, and he accepted an offer to produce erotic audio tapes in his home studio, but it only got him 10 days. His band, the Mothers of Invention, made their first album, Freak Out, in 1966. He moved to Laurel Canyon with Susie Cream Cheese. He signed a 6-month contract with a New York theater, so went to Laurel Canyon, signed a contract, and then went to a New York theater. He invited GIs to treat a doll on stage like, and I apologize, but this is what the book said, a gook baby, and these GIs went up on stage and tore this doll apart. He encouraged it. In the fall of 67, he married Gail Sloatman, a personal assistant for cop and gangster club owner Elmer Valentine. 1 week later, their daughter, Moon Unit, was born. They had a son, Dweezil, a son, Amit, and a son, Dwathan, and a daughter, Diva Thin Muffin Pigeon. That's her name. Diva Thin Muffin Pigeon, I don't know. Anyway, he pulled out of school. His children pulled them all out of school at the age of 15 and refused to pay for college. He didn't think they should go to school. He lived in the log cabin in Laurel Canyon, and people lived in every nook and cranny, tunnels, caves, hideaways. Every room in the house had somebody weird. He started 2 record labels, Bizarre Records and Straight Records. And he signed Larry Wildman Fisher, who was born November 6th of 44. His dad had died young. His mother was distant and emotionally abusive. He got kicked out of high school. He had no friends. He was institutionalized at 16 for attacking his mother with a knife. He attacked her later twice more, and he also attacked his brother with a knife. Frank Zappa gave him a recording contract. Don Glenn Vliet, born the 15th of January 1941 in Glendale. He was the grandson of the cousin of Nazi sympathizer Wallace Simpson. In 65, he called himself Beefheart and formed this band. He was Captain Beefheart. The Magic Band was the name of the album. They did 13 albums between 65 and 82. He played the harmonica and the sax. In 69, they made a thing called Trout Mask Replica, which Zappa released, considered the greatest rock album of all time. It's on YouTube. Look it up. It is something else. It was experimental. It's like atonal. The timing is all off. I mean, everybody plays at a different time, and it's just really strange. He made in his house, he made everybody in the band, I'd forgotten about this, he made everybody in the band stay locked up in his house while they recorded this album. They were there for 8 months. They weren't allowed to leave. He controlled when they ate and slept, and it was a cult-like brainwashing sort of situation. It was very strange. There are a lot of Manson-like qualities and characters around Zappa. Vito and all those girls, Beefheart and his control and his weirdness, and Zappa himself. In 69, the Mothers of Invention disbanded because Zappa was a control freak and they couldn't stand it. He was cold and distant and difficult. He would like to hang out in his studio alone all day and didn't want anybody to disturb him. He wanted nobody in his family to talk to him. He wanted to be left alone. He was an elitist. He stayed at the fanciest hotels while the members of his band had to double up in crappy hotels. David Anderle of MGM Records perhaps summed up Zappa best. I always felt there was something a little totalitarian about Frank. I was awed by the clarity of the vision and his ability to make it happen, but it was without warmth. He would go on messianic diatribes. He moved to a new Laurel Canyon house with very tight security. Eric Burdon got the log cabin, and he said working with Zappa was like working with Hitler. Zappa moved after a visit from a strange guy with a gun called the Raven came to his house. And interestingly enough, they're making some connections here in this book that maybe that was Jim Jones, who used to travel around with a gun and call himself the Raven, and he had just arrived in LA at the time. In July 14th of 1982, Zappa was performing in Sicily when a riot broke out between cops and the armed audience, and all the security for the performance was mafia. The Italian army had to be called out. In September of 85, he testified about Tipper Gore's efforts to label music, and he thought it was censorship, and he gave serious thought about running for president. In 1990, he was invited to Czechoslovakia by Václav Havel to be a consultant on trade and tourism. Come to Czechoslovakia to see communism die. I have been an enthusiastic capitalist for years, is what he says. He met with multi-international corporations to start to break down trade barriers, and the numbers of trips that he made to Russia, he claimed were business trips, but he made many. And he died in December of 93 at the age of 52 from cancer. He was buried the very same day in an unmarked grave. How weird is that? In 2001, his son Amit dated Rose Mcgowan, who was an actress, who talked about her childhood in a pedophilic Children of God cult. And also members were Joaquin and River Phoenix. Rose first dated Marilyn Manson, the fourth cousin of Pat Buchanan, and a high priest in Anton LaVey's Church of Satan. Let's take a little break. I may stop here for the night because I'm having trouble seeing. We'll see. We'll see how I feel about it. If I don't come back tonight, I'll come back tomorrow. I hope you're enjoying this. It just continues to get stranger and stranger. So that's the end of 7, I believe, and we will proceed with number 8 afoot, apace. Thank you very much for watching. Sláinte.